Hello, and welcome to revision tips for CIPS Level 4 Diploma in Procurement and Supply. This is Module 6, Supplier Relationships, and it's Learning Outcome 2, which is to understand processes and procedures for successful working with your stakeholders. So we're going to look at the purpose of organisational procedures and processes, compare the team management techniques for effective and positive stakeholder relationships, the practical considerations of stakeholder management and the processes for terminating them. So value for money is often a term that's described when we're looking at something called the 3 E's, but there's actually a fourth one now that you can see on the screen. The first three were economy, efficiency and effectiveness, and then we've got equity as well. But economy is about saving money, minimising costs for the business in terms of its resources used, spending less. Efficiency is about saving time, and it's the relationship between the output of the product or service and the resources used to produce it. And then effectiveness is the extent to which objectives are met, so something like spending wisely. Now, the UK National Audit Office notes that in some areas there's a fourth E, which mainly applies to public sector organisations. And it's equity, the extent to which services are available to and reach all of the people they're intended to. So it's about spending fairly. Now, typical factors that are taken into account when defining value for money, according to CIPS, are things like, is it fit for purpose? Does it actually do what it's meant to do? Does the quality of the service meet the required levels? And this will vary considerably from one procurement to another, depending on the nature. The total lifetime cost. So what is the total cost of purchasing the goods or services? What is the risk? And any environmental or sustainable issues, as well as any other factors that contribute to the proposed solution for the organisation's overall goals. So achieving value for money is the procurement process where we provide guidelines and governance for stakeholders, and it's all about their expected behaviours. So it could be down to things like threshold values and helping procurement professionals to achieve value for money. Now, each organisation will have its own internal organisational procedures and processes for its sourcing. But some of those that are operating, for example, in the public sector, will also have to abide by legislation, such as public contract regulations. Now, the procurement cycle is a key process because it has inputs from procurement professionals at each stage of the way, just to ensure that we're achieving value for money. Now, you can see on the screen there's different ways that we can do that, and when we should and when we shouldn't use competitive bidding. So you should use competitive bidding when you've got sufficient value in terms of the tender, so it's worthwhile for the supplier, where you can clearly specify it, and where competition exists in the market. So it's no good doing it if there's only one supplier. And you need enough time to conduct that process competently and properly, because it takes a long time to digest information in a tender, and you need enough time for the suppliers to respond and enough time to evaluate. So it's not going to be a quick process. But don't use it if you don't think it's possible to establish the baseline or the budget accurately, if you think the spec's going to change, or if price isn't the main driver. Now, supplier identification in the public sector is much more transparent than the private sector. The private sector is free to advertise to any market, small or large. But in the public sector, the buyer is required to advertise in the official journal to the European Union over a certain threshold. In the private sector, there's no requirements to facilitate the advertising process. But in the public sector, the buyer must choose a common procurement vocabulary code. Now, in the private sector, there's a number of tender returns, and they'll be based on the market in which the buyer advertises them. But in the public sector, the process can result in a high number of tender returns, especially in areas where there is a high number of suppliers. In the private sector, this could be having meetings and negotiations that take place throughout the process. And the public sector are able to undertake vendor management events, but only prior to a contract being advertised. And then they'll get a best offer based on the requirements, BOBOR. That can be used in the private sector, and it considers and uses the priorities and requirements that have been agreed at the identification of need stage. Price and quality may not be in play at this part of the criteria, but tangible and intangible aspects are considered, such as aesthetics, along with overall benefits in creating competitive advantage for the organisation. But the public sector will use the most economically advantageous tender, the MEET criteria. And that enables them to take account of criteria that's qualitative, technical, and sustainable aspects of the tender submission, as well as the price to reach an award decision. Now, tenders will often include a guide on how they're going to be marked. And here we show a tender evaluation example, and it's looking like a matrix. The score can range from simple percentage splits to complex weight systems, but the basic principle of a tender evaluation remains the same. And in the public sector, tenders need to be based on that mix of price and non-price factors. So, as I said earlier, this is the best economically advantageous tender. But the best offer based on requirements will be used in the private sector, considering the user's priorities and requirements. Now, the tender evaluation criteria for quality is often split into different categories, and they will have their own weightings according to the perceived importance. And some of them are subdivided, showing individual elements of the specific value. These often relate to individual questions. Now, stakeholder management is all about identifying who your internal and external stakeholders are. And you can use the Mendelow's matrix to map them. And that's what you can see on the screen. This looks at two axes. The horizontal one is the stakeholder's level of interest, and the vertical one is the level of power or influence that that stakeholder may have. So those with high power and high interest are your key players where you need to manage closely. High power but low interest is the ones you need to keep satisfied. They're usually your senior managers. The ones with high interest and low power, you need to keep them informed. But minimal effort is required for those with low power and low interest. Now, in order to overcome resistance, you need to be able to identify where it might come from. So another 2x2 grid plots stakeholder support of the project against the influence they exert on other stakeholders. This produces 4 quadrants. Now, negative leaders represent the biggest threat of resistance. They have a negative view of the project and a high influence. Resistance from these lots of individuals may be due to conflict between their own department objectives and the procurement department's objectives, or it could actually be personal. So an example is a buyer may want to undertake a competitive process to assess whether a supplier still represents the best option for the organisation, while the end user wants to continue using a supplier that they've always used. Resistance and the resulting conflict can cause delays and waste resources. So to overcome resistance, procurement need to understand what the drivers are for resistance. Is it fear of change or uncertainty? Manage the resistance by involving the stakeholder in the planning and supplier identification process, ensuring they're kept informed and persuading them to merit the project, showing them the benefits and addressing the reasons that they're resisting the project. We also need to use our soft skills like persuasion and influence to build the relationship with that key stakeholder so that we can engage them in the process, converting those resisting stakeholders and finding out what information would influence their decision and how they might wish to receive that information. But it's important you identify these resistors early because that can help to anticipate their actions and it means that plans can be put in place to manage them. But also, you need to identify your promoters. These are the ones with the highest level of support and influence. So if you do that early, they can help you to change the mindset of the resistors. And this is particularly useful for procurement projects and will result in significant organisational change, such as purchasing and rolling out a new e-procurement system. So keep promoters informed in order to retain their support. But overcoming resistance is really strongly linked to change management. Now, when you hear the name Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, it's probably because of her influential work on death and dying. So you might be surprised to find her 5-stage model being used to understand change management. But the stages were first observed as a human response to learning about terminal illness. They've also been used to understand our individual responses to all kinds of change. Now, we don't move through these stages one at a time in a neat, linear, step-by-step manner. What happens is that we occupy different stages at different times. And we can actually go back to different stages we've been in before. But ideally, it would be good to think that we can reach a phase of acceptance without managing the change. But some people get stuck in the stage and find it really difficult or impossible to move on. Now, force field analysis was developed by Kurt Lewin in 1951. Now, this is a widely used tool to inform decision making, particularly with regards to managing change. The method you can use to gain comprehensive overview and assess the sources and strengths of all the different forces that are acting on a potential organisational issue or change. And the idea behind this field force analysis is that situations are maintained by an equilibrium between the forces that drive change and others that resist it. So for change to happen, the driving force must be stronger than the resisting force. Now, the Thomas-Kilmann model is also designed to measure a person's behaviour in conflict situations. Competing is assertive but uncooperative, so an individual pursues their own concerns at the expense of others. Accommodating is an unassertive and cooperative stance, so it's the complete opposite of competing. So when you're accommodating, you neglect your own needs to satisfy others. Avoiding is both unassertive and uncooperative, so you neither pursue your own or those of others. Collaborating is both assertive and cooperative, again, the complete opposite of avoiding. Collaborating involves an attempt to work with others to try and find a solution that fully satisfies their concerns. And compromising is both assertive and cooperative in a moderate sense, because you're trying to find some sort of middle ground. Now, cross-functional teams are teams that include members of different areas of the organisation, and maybe even some external stakeholders like suppliers and customers. And the benefits of these cross-functional teams is you get increased productivity, where the team can generate ideas better and generate more several ideas that they could on their own. You get improved quality because the team will make an informed decision and agree on the optimum solution for all areas. You get innovation from team members bringing different perspectives, which again enables innovation. Technological advancements, which is opportunities to share knowledge across the business, and improved motivation, where members and representatives of that area are more motivated. Improved company efficiency because ideas that can be examined are applied to different areas, and improved relationships. That breaks down the barriers between departments and helps individuals to understand the obstacles that are facing their colleagues in other departments. It will improve your knowledge. You'll have more specialist knowledge and skill sets. Quicker achievements, which means you can do things quicker, more hands make light work. And improved communications is where you build up trust and open communication, where you can freely develop opinions and ideas without the fear of criticism. But teams don't naturally come together and they're perfect straight away. They go through stages of formation. And this is the Tuckman model, from forming, storming, norming to performing. In the forming stage, there is a high dependency on the leader for guidance and direction, and little agreement on team aims other than what's received from the leader. But the individual roles and responsibilities are a little bit unclear here. As you move into the storming stage, decisions don't come easy within the group, Team members vie for position as they attempt to establish themselves in relation to other team members and the leader, who might receive challenges from other team members. So clarity of purpose increases, but plenty of uncertainties persist. There's a lot of conflict in this stage. But then norming agreement happens and a consensus largely forms amongst the team, who respond well to facilitation by the leader. At this point, roles and responsibilities are clear and accepted, and decisions are made by group agreement. So when performing, the team has a high degree of autonomy. Disagreements occur, but now they can be resolved with the team in a positive way. And the team is able to work towards achieving the goal and also to attend to the relationship, the style, and progress issues along the way. Accurate cost modelling can be achieved through relationship management with internal stakeholders, and that can include users and finance. Cross-functional teams can benefit the modelling through cooperation and collaboration. But this cost modelling can be achieved by capturing and understanding the cost drivers, building specific models, considering the total cost of ownership, keeping the models simple to start with and then triangulating the data. Now, prices fluctuate, and that could be due to scarcity, and this is a consequence. This cause may be due to a number of factors around the steeple analysis, so social, technological, economic, ethical, political, legal, or environmental. And price elasticity is a measure of the responsiveness of supply and demand for a good or service. If, for example, the demand changes, it could affect the price. So the price elasticity of demand measures the ratio of the proportionate change in quantity demanded to the proportionate change of price. So the impact of fluctuations can be reduced by monitoring, buying safety stocks, working with the suppliers, and constructing detailed plans in advance. So going into a little bit more detail about that, some of the reasons that prices fluctuate could include a product that is no longer available or a new product coming onto the market. And that could sometimes cause demand to outstrip supply. There could be increases in things like import duties, or exchange rates may rise or fall. Could even be political instability, like a change in government that can affect the price. And the frequency and magnitude of the extremes have maybe increased, which is likely to be a result of globalization. So going into a bit more detail about the things we can do to reduce the impacts. Firstly, try and identify the potential risk areas. Which products or services are most vulnerable to price increases? Put plans and processes in place to mitigate against any potential price increase, like fixing the price. You could forward buy, which is when you purchase a greater quantity at the beginning, more than what you currently require. But I suppose what you're doing is saying, we will commit to that volume, but we don't want to buy it all at once. But you can then confirm a fixed price, which will avoid any price increases. You can work with the stakeholders like the suppliers, and those suppliers can give procurement a better view of when price fluctuations might occur. And building those collaborative relationships with suppliers will minimise the potential impact of price fluctuations for both parties. You can work with suppliers on some supply chain efficiency projects, and that helps you to remove waste and reduce the cost elsewhere. And that's if increases are unavoidable. And prepare strategies to deal with the increase. If import duties are going to increase substantially, then you could source from an alternative supplier in a different country. But once suppliers become aware of any likely increases, they need to inform their internal stakeholders so they can plan for their budgets. When suppliers are involved early, their participation can range from providing information about equipment and capabilities for design to taking full responsibility for designing parts and components for a procurement. The level and benefit will depend on how complex the procurement is. By involving the supplier at the product design stage, they can have the most impact unless the product is redesigned. Now, businesses seek to secure a competitive advantage, and that's in order to increase their profitability. To support the process of gaining competitive advantage, a buyer will need to gain or have additional knowledge of the products or services. And they can do that through marketplace development, as well as obtaining access to innovation. To achieve this, the buyer will typically target key suppliers, which they have the most collaborative relationships. And the benefits are cost savings and building those better relationships, improving your portfolio, which demonstrates value, as well as cultural changes. But the risks include the management of any intellectual property and the potential of competitive advantage being leaked. Now, common metrics to drive change for both organisations. You can see that on the screen. It comes from Damlin. They list 6 quantitative KPIs that can be used as common metrics, and they measure both the buyer and supplier relationships. So trust is first. As dependency increases, trust becomes more important. Power. This arises due to the dependencies. If a supplier is dependent on the buyer, it creates power, and vice versa. Transparency and information sharing. That can be tactical or strategic. And communication. This is the glue that holds the supply chain together. Commitment is the willingness of the parties to contract and put efforts into the relationship. And cooperation, and that's needed across supply chains for them to be successful. Another thing we can do is to try and improve our risk management. And this is so that you can get continuity of supply. And risk management initially is about identifying what could go wrong. It's sort of what-if analysis. The second step is the assessment of that risk. And you assess it based on the likelihood that that will happen. And if it did, what would the impact be? So imagine likelihood being 1, hardly ever going to happen, through to 5, it's absolutely certain that it would happen. And impact being as little as 1, it doesn't really affect me massively, all the way up to a 5, it would be catastrophic. The highest assessment score you could get is 5 times 5, which is 25. And that would represent a high priority risk. Once you've multiplied the likelihood by the impact, you will have a score ranging from 1 to 25. That will then enable you to rank them, prioritising the highest risk first, and then deciding how you're going to manage it. And the way to manage risk is either to tolerate it because the risk is really low, to treat it in some way, like take out insurance, you're mitigating the risks. Actually, that's more of a transfer approach. Transfer would be insurance. Treat it would be to take steps to reduce that risk. So let's say there's a risk of a risk of a car accident. You might take lessons so that you would reduce the likelihood of having an accident. And then you can terminate a risk if the risk is too great to tolerate. Now, the most common reasons for terminating a contract is because the contract has come to its natural end and there's no longer a requirement to purchase that good or service. It could be that the contract has reached its end date specified in the terms and conditions, so you've re-tendered it and another supplier can provide a more competitive offer. It may be because you've decided to undertake supply-based rationalisation, or you suddenly find that the supplier has increased the price with no justification, or the buyer suddenly increases, the contract with the supplier is terminated due to a material breach. And that could be something like poor performance. If a supplier is constantly underperforming, then a buyer may wish to end the agreement. And default clauses will state that any default will trigger either party the right to terminate the contract. This can result in conflict actually as well as legal proceedings. And that could be things like arbitration, mediation, or even the courts. And in some cases, this could have this could have been amplified by the lack of performance and contract management. It could be because the supplier activities damage the reputation of the buyer by association. Like if you're breaching human rights through the use of child labour, and that's uncovered, you may decide that you don't want to be associated with them. Could be that the supplier becomes insolvent, which again could be classed as a material breach. That would enable the buyer to formally end the relationship and seek an alternative supplier. But if the supplier is critical and the buyer and supplier have chosen to close the relationship, the buyer may need to take steps to support the supplier. What about if the supplier merges with another or is acquired by another company? This is particularly likely to lead to termination if that company is a competitor. Most contracts do allow for termination if there is a change of ownership. I mean, the supplier could terminate the relationship because they no longer wish to deal with the buyer as a customer. And that's if the business isn't profitable. And in this situation, the buyer would view the buyer as a nuisance. And in rare circumstances, a contract can be terminated due to contract frustration, meaning the obligations of the contract become impossible to perform as a result of unforeseen incidents beyond their parties' control. Now, UK law states that when a contract frustration occurs, the contract can be terminated. And it can be avoided by adding a force majeure clause, naming the possible events which the events are classed as foreseen. Now, the process for terminating contracts you can see on the screen. So if poor performance has been identified, the supplier should be given an opportunity to rectify the problem. If there's no improvement after that, the buyer will have to start the termination process. So liaise with the stakeholders to identify any possible financial and operational threats to the business of terminating the contract. The ops and sales team will know about the volumes of supplies needed over the coming weeks. The legal team will be able to advise on potential negative effects of termination, such as any early termination fees. The finance team will be able to review how this might affect the buyer's financial situation. You then develop a business case for your senior managers to approve the termination, especially if the supplier is a strategic one or the value of the contract is high. Develop a detailed exit strategy, ensuring that there is minimal disruption to the organisation's day-to-day operations. And then review the market and qualify a new supplier to ensure that operations can continue and that there will be continuity of supply. Then you obtain business approval to terminate, give written notice to terminate with the supplier, and this needs to be managed carefully and considerately. It may generally state that the notice period, for example, 30 or 90 days. And then you need to manage the exit and the new supplier onboarding, ensuring the crossover period is managed carefully. This stage is easier if the contract clearly sets out each party's responsibilities. Now, aim to end the buyer-supplier relationships amicably if possible. If contract termination results in hostile behaviour from the supplier, it's likely that the transition of services will be a little bit more difficult. Now, relationship impacts can be either amicable or hostile. So when terminating the relationships, it is important to handle the situation delicately. There should be appropriate time and place to inform the supplier of the termination. And that's to avoid a potential confrontation in an uncomfortable environment. It's important for participants to stay calm and avoid any negative behaviour. Supplier needs to be given an honest explanation for the termination and to make sure that it's delivered clearly and concisely. And the parties should avoid emotional responses and stay logical. And finally, alternative dispute resolutions may be considered, including mediation. We're now going to look at the legal considerations such as finance, confidentiality, intellectual property, security, and employee rights. We've touched briefly on legal considerations regarding termination, such as frustration, but the buyer should also be aware of any financial requirements that are related to that termination in the terms and conditions of the contract. There could be some rights regarding confidentiality and intellectual property, security of data, and employee rights, which are covered by the transfer of undertakings for the protection of employment, often abbreviated to 2P. Now, successions issues helps us with the continuity of supply. So an exit strategy should set forth the organisation's service requirements for the period during which the parties are transitioning out of the relationship. And these requirements may include an obligation to maintain the same service level, the same commitment, maintain the confidentiality and quality, and ensure that delivery is being maintained prior to the start of the termination process. And that's the end of this session. Thank you for watching.